everyone and welcome to my channel. Today I'm sharing 30 of my favorite Christmas DIYs that I've shared so far here on my channel. Since this is a combination of a lot of the projects, they are numbered a little bit out of order, so just keep that in mind while you're watching. I really hope that you enjoyed today's video. Now let's go ahead and jump right into it. For DIY number 1, I'm making a rustic crate. And for this one, I'm using one of these mini unfinished wooden crates from Dollar Tree. These crates are perfect for so many different projects. I love them. And I'm also using some of these wood stems also from the Dollar Tree. What's perfect is these wood stems are already pre-cut to the exact size of this mini wooden crate, so I didn't have to cut them down at all. And I'm going to be attaching them right to the side of my wood crate. To do that, as you can see here, I'm just placing hot glue on one side of the wood stem and then placing that onto the crate. And I continued that same step over and over again until I had all 4 sides of my wood crate completely covered with the stems. For the inside of my crate, I'm going to be using some of these really pretty green florals from Michaels. These ones I had last year. I had to get more this year because they were so pretty. And I'm also using some of these frosted ferns from Dollar Tree. And another item from Dollar Tree is this glittered drape. This is supposed to be like fake snow. I'm just cutting this drape down a little bit, just a small piece. I'm going to be taking this, folding it up, and placing it on the bottom of my crate, just kind of as like a filler, but I didn't want that glitter on there, so I just shook it off a little bit, and it came off pretty easily. Once I had it all shook off, I just placed it in the inside. You could always use a floral foam if you didn't have like the fake snow. And then for the greenery that I'm using, I am cutting it down a little bit to have the pieces easier to work with. And then the pine cones that I'm using here to fill the inside of the crate are from Hobby Lobby. And then as you'll see here in a minute, I ended up just using one large pine cone, and then I took really small pine cones that came in a bundle of pine cones from Dollar Tree, and I placed those all around the large pine cone and then around all of the frosted and greenery stems. And then I did add in some of those berries that were on the green stems from Michaels. To add just a little bit more detail to the front of my crate, I'm stringing 7 of these mini bells from Dollar Tree onto a piece of jute, and then to attach it to the front of my crate, I just tied off both ends of the piece of jute, and then I hot glued each of those ends on the inside of the crate along the front. And here is my rustic crate all finished. This goes perfect with the theme that I have in my home this Christmas. And if you wanted to use this piece all winter long, you could just pick out the berries and remove the bells from the front, and it would make a perfect winter piece. Now moving into DIY number 2, I'm making Christmas coasters. For this project, I already had these 4 unfinished wooden coasters from Hobby Lobby. They're really inexpensive, and I've just had them hanging out in my stash, and I finally figured out what I was going to do with them. If you didn't have these ones, you could always use 4 square pieces of wood and then just put felt on the bottom of them. I'm first starting by using my Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory, and I'm painting 2 coats of this paint on all 4 of my coasters, and I did paint the bottom of the coasters as well, just making sure to go around the felt. Once those were all painted and dry, and then taking some of these stencils from Dollar Tree last year, and for this first stencil I'm using the Santa face and the words ho ho ho. So I just cut those out with some scissors, and then I placed it right in the center of one of my coasters. But to hold it into place, I used painter's tape on the top and bottom of the stencil. For the stencil color, I'm using the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Rich Black, and I'm using a Dollar Tree stencil brush to apply the paint. Once I was done stenciling and the paint was dry, then I just removed the stencil and all of the painter's tape. Then for the next 3 coasters, I'm using stencils once again to create my images. For this next one, I'm using this reindeer that was in the center of one of the stencils I had from Amazon. But if you have the Dollar Tree stencils from last year, they do have a reindeer on them. I just really liked the one from Amazon. So I'm just placing that in the center of the coaster just like I did the last stencil, and then using my Dollar Tree stencil brush to apply my rich black paint. And again, just did the same thing using different stencils from Dollar Tree for the next two coasters. For my coaster with the sleigh, I did want to have a word underneath the sleigh. So I'm using this Merry Christmas stencil from Hobby Lobby, which you guys have seen me use in other videos of mine. I just taped it on to where just the word Merry would be underneath the sleigh, and then I just stenciled that right on. Then to make sure that my coasters are okay to have water on them, I needed to seal them. So I'm using this Rust-Oleum Clear Matte Sealer Spray, and I'm just doing a few coats of this spray on all of my coasters. Here are my Christmas coasters all finished. I think they turned out super cute, but what I really love about these is they are really customizable to fit your own decor. You could use whatever kinds of stencils that you want with whatever color that you want. Next, for DIY number 3, I'm making faux Christmas books. For this project, I'm using 3 pieces of 7-inch by 3.5-inch pieces of scrap wood, and I'm starting out by painting all 3 pieces of wood with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory, and I did have to do 2 coats of paint on each piece of wood. Once my wood was all dry, I then took my folk art chalk paint in the color Java on a small paintbrush, and then I just dry brushed this color along all of the edges of all of my wood pieces. Next, I'm attaching all 3 pieces of wood together, and to do that, I'm using hot glue. I simply just put hot glue on one side of one of the pieces of wood and stuck another piece of wood on top of it, and I continued that step for the 3rd piece of wood. Once they were all glued together, it was time for me to stamp on my words. I am using all lowercase stamped letters, and these ones are from Michaels, and I'm just doing a traditional black ink for the color of my stamped letters. And for the first block, I'm doing the word Merry. My letters are not perfect next to each other, but I think that this gives it more of like a vintage rustic feel, and I really love the way it turned out. For my second block, I did the word Farmhouse, and then for my 3rd block on the bottom, I did the word Christmas. I wish I would have done the word Christmas a little bit farther over, more to the right, but it is what it is. It ended up turning out cute, I think, and very rustic and vintage. To add some details to my faux book, I'm using some of this really pretty ribbon that I got from Dollar General. I just wish it would have been a little bit thicker. So to create a thicker ribbon, I'm just wrapping this thin ribbon around my books twice. Then to secure everything in place, I'm just hot gluing the ends of the ribbon on the bottom side of my faux books. I really wanted that pop of green, so I'm using a small piece of greenery that I had laying around from another project. I'm just hot gluing that on the top of my books, right over top of the ribbon. Then to add even more detail, I'm taking a really long piece of jute and I'm wrapping it randomly around where I have the greenery and the ribbon, and then I'm tying that jute in a bow right over top of the greenery that I've already attached. And then for the last little detail, I decided to add 2 of these tiny bells from Dollar Tree right over top of my bow. And here are my faux rustic Christmas books all finished. I think they turned out really, really good. I've seen so many different versions of these faux books done, and I have yet to make them until now, and I'm really glad I did because they are the perfect little accent piece with my decor. Now for the 4th and final DIY today, I'm making a mini rope tree. For this one, I'm using one of these styrofoam trees. This came in a pack from Hobby Lobby. And I'm starting by placing hot glue on the base of this styrofoam tree. And then I'm attaching some of this white cotton cord, also from Hobby Lobby, right on top of that hot glue to attach it to my styrofoam tree. And I'm just continuing this step over and over again until I have the whole styrofoam tree covered with this white cotton cord. Then when I've gotten to the top of my tree, I just cut the cotton cord and then hot glue the end of that cord down with some hot glue to a point. Next, I'm using one of these birch wood chunks from Dollar Tree. I wasn't exactly sure which chunk shape would go best with my tree, so I just tried out a few of them until I got the perfect tree trunk. And I'm just hot gluing that right onto my styrofoam tree. I'm putting hot glue right onto the wood and then sticking my tree on top of it. To decorate my little tree, I'm using some of this red berry garland, also from Dollar Tree, and I'm wrapping the garland around my tree starting at the base of the tree and then working its way up. Since this is a wired garland, I really didn't have to attach it too much, but I did place a little bit of hot glue in a few random places just to make sure everything stays nice and secure. And to finish my tree, I'm attaching one of these unfinished wood stars from Hobby Lobby onto the top of my tree using some hot glue. This is my mini tree all finished. I think it goes perfect with any rustic Christmas theme, and it was really inexpensive and easy to create. For the first DIY, I'm making over a Christmas sled. I picked this cute little sled up at Goodwill and I paid $2.99 for it. Overall, it was in really good shape. The paint on it was a little bit chipped up, but I knew that I could transform it into something that would fit with my Christmas decor that I have in my home. What I'm first doing to transform it is I'm painting both of the legs of the sled with the folk art chalk paint in the color Tuscan Red. I did have to do 2 coats of this paint on both of the legs. I really love this red because it's a little bit more of a deeper red and it goes really good with rustic Christmas decor. Once the legs were all dry, I then moved on to the base of the sled and I painted that with my folk art chalk paint in the color Rich Black. I only had to do 1 coat of this paint because black pretty much covers up anything. And I did paint the entire base. I painted the front side, all of the edges, and then I did flip the sleigh over and I painted the entire back side as well because you want your project to look completely finished, and even though you're not going to see the back side, I still wanted to have it painted. Next, I wanted to add some more detail to the front of my sled. So here I'm taking just a regular paintbrush and some Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory, and I'm dry brushing that color around all of the edges and then also on the very top base of the sled as well. Once that was dry, I then took this It's the Most Wonderful Time of Year stencil from Dollar Tree last year, which I've already used it a bunch, but I'm still using it this year. I'm placing it in the center of my sled, but a little bit farther down from the top so that I'll have some room to add some greenery on later on. And then I'm just using some painter's tape to tape that stencil into place so it doesn't move around while I'm stenciling. For the color that I'm stenciling, it's once again that Waverly paint in the color Ivory, and I am using a Dollar Tree stencil brush to apply the paint. Once all of my stencil paint dried, I then removed my painter's tape and my stencil. As you can see, the painter's tape did take off some of the black paint and was showing some of the underneath color, so I did have to go back and touch that up a little bit, but it was no big deal and it only took me a couple of minutes. Now I'm adding some distressing to the legs of my sled, and to do that I'm using some sandpaper, and I just ran that paper around all of the edges of the sled and then a little bit along the sides of the legs as well. I am using a 60 grit sandpaper, which is really coarse. I usually use like a 120, but this is the only one I had in the house at the moment, and I actually really love how this distressed the legs, so I might be using a coarser grit in the future. It gave me exactly the look I was going for. Next, I'm going to be adding some greenery. I am using 2 of these from Walmart. They were $1.49 a piece, and they're great quality. They do come with a bell. One of them I already removed the bell and used that on another project, but I'm not going to be using bells in this project, so I'm just removing the other one from the second stem. Once I had the bell removed, I then did not want the clips on these either, so I'm using some wire cutters to cut down the wires a little bit and take off those clips. Then I'm attaching the greenery to the top of my sled. I am using hot glue to do this. I just put the glue right onto the sled and then push the greenery on the glue. I did have to hold it in place until the glue was all set and dry because these were a little bit heavier and they did take a minute to set onto the glue. And I also clipped off the berries that were on the stems. I'm also adding a bow to the very top of my sled, and I'm using this Christmas ribbon from Walmart. I just made a really simple bow and just made it to the size that I wanted it before I clipped off the ends. Now the tail ends of my bow, I did want to have those in a diagonal shape, so I did cut those into a diagonal shape. I then used hot glue to attach the bow in the center of my greenery, and I was going to leave it as is, but I had these little pine cones from Dollar Tree laying around and I thought they would be really cute around the bow, so I just hot glued some of those around each side of my bow. Then for the last step, I did end up hot gluing those berries back onto the greenery because I thought that pop of red would just be really cute. And this is my Christmas sled all finished. I cannot believe I only paid $2.99 for this, and I was able to transform it into something that would go in my home with all of my rustic Christmas decor. I love thrifting so much. This would have cost so much more if I would have bought it already finished in a retail store. Now moving into DIY number 2, I'm making over a Christmas serving tray. This tray I found at Goodwill. It is a completely wood tray. It was $2.99 and it's fairly large, and I was really excited when I found it because I knew I could make something really great out of it. To transform it, I am starting out by painting it with the Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory. I did have to do 3 different coats of this paint to get everything all covered up. It had like old paint marks and stuff on it, so I did have to do several coats of this paint. I did paint the front, all of the sides, and then the back side as well because I wanted this to be an entirely finished project. After my paint was all dry, I knew I wanted to have it look really distressed and rustic like the rest of the decor in my home. So I'm taking the 60 grit sandpaper and I'm running that along all of the edges of the tray. And then also on the bottom base part of the tray, I'm doing the sandpaper, but I'm only doing it in the up and down motions to make it look pretty consistent. I didn't want to have streaks everywhere, so I just did it in the up and down. And then to add a little bit more distressing, I'm using my folk art chalk paint in the color Java on a chip brush, and I'm dry brushing this color along the entire tray, pretty much in the same spots where I sanded, and just randomly placing more paint in spots than others, again to give it that really nice distressed rustic look. And I did do this dry brushing technique on all of the edges, the front side, and the back as well, again to keep everything nice and consistent. Next, I'm using this fresh cut Christmas tree stencil that I picked up from Amazon. It did come in a pack of stencils, and I will have those linked down in the description box. I'm placing it in the center of my tray, only it was a little bit too large since the edges of my tray are round, so I just cut the edges of the stencil off so that it would fit in my tray. Once I had it all centered, I then used some painter's tape around the edges of the stencil to hold it into place so that it doesn't move around when I'm painting. Then I started stenciling on my paint, and this is the folk art chalk paint in the color Rich Black, and I am using a Dollar Tree stencil brush to apply the paint. Once I had the top portion of all of my words stenciled on, I was moving down to where the trees are on the stencil, and I knew that I did not want to get the green color that I'm going to be using on where like the bottom words are on the stencil. So I'm just using some painter's tape to cover the bottom section off, and then stenciling the Spanish moss from folk art with my Dollar Tree stencil brush right over top of all of the trees. Once I had the trees all painted, I then removed the painter's tape and then continued stenciling the underneath words in that same folk art chalk paint in the color ink. Or not ink, I'm sorry, Rich Black. Then once the paint was all dry, I'm then removing all of the painter's tape and the stencil from the tray. Here is my Christmas tree serving tray all finished. This looks so high-end. A little bit of paint can really go a long way. I literally added some paint and sanded the edges and it turned out absolutely beautiful. Now moving into the third and final makeover for today, I'm making an ornament picture. For this one, I'm simply using a wooden picture frame that I picked up from Goodwill. I paid 99 cents for it. I love getting picture frames at thrift stores because you can get them so much cheaper than buying them in store, and they're usually like all wooden, real wood, and the ones you get from Dollar Tree obviously are not real wood. So to start out, I'm painting mine with that Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory. I did 2 coats of paint on the entire frame. Once that was dry, or while that was drying, I took 6 of these large popsicle sticks and I also painted those with that same ivory colored chalk paint. And I only did the front side of the popsicle sticks because the back side you're not going to see, so I did not waste any time painting those. After the ivory color was dry, I knew I wanted to have these distressed, so I'm taking some of that folk art paint in the color Rich Black and I'm dry brushing that around the edges and then the front side of all of my popsicle sticks. Next, I'm attaching all 6 of the sticks on the back side of my frame, and to do that, I'm using hot glue on the top and bottom of each popsicle stick, and then just pressing those down on the back side of the frame. For this project, I'm also going to be using this unfinished Merry Christmas wooden ornament that I picked up from Michael's. It says it was $1.99, but I'm almost positive I only paid $1 for it. I think it was half off. And for the paint that I'm using on it, I'm using around all of the vines that are on the inside of the ornament. I'm doing those with a Spanish moss from Folk Art. And then for around the outside edges of the ornament and then all of the words, the Merry Christmas words, I'm using the paint in the color Rich Black. Once I have those painted, for the berries that are around all of the vines, I'm using the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Imperial. And then for the star, I'm using the ivory color from Waverly. Next, I'm placing hot glue along the back side of my painted ornament and I'm pressing that right in the center of the popsicle sticks that I've attached to the back of my frame. Once that's all in place, I knew I wanted to add some greenery. This is leftover greenery from last year. I believe these were from Michael's or Joann Fabrics, but I'm not exactly sure. I'm just cutting those down really small so that I can attach them to the very top of my ornament. I'm placing hot glue right onto the greenery stems and then just pressing those on the top of the ornament. And then to add a little bit more color, I'm using some of this rope. This I actually picked up from the Target dollar spot around Valentine's Day last year, but the red and white works perfect for Christmas time. So I'm just making a really simple small bow with the rope and then cutting that down to size and attaching it in the center top portion of my ornament right over top of the greenery that I've already attached. And this is my Christmas ornament sign all finished. It works perfect on a shelf or table and it really adds that pop of color with the red. For only 99 cents, I think it was a great makeover. For DIY number 1, I'm making a Merry Christmas porch sign. For this one, I picked up a wood plank from Hobby Lobby. This one is from the Woodpile brand and it is 48 inches by 9 inches and 1/8. Once I had the tag that was on the back of the wood plank off, I then started painting the entire thing with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory. I did have to do 2 different coats of this paint to get everything covered up nicely the way I wanted it to be. Next, I'm going to be using some of these stencils that I picked up from Amazon. It did come in a pack of stencils and they were really inexpensive. I'm going to be using the one that says Merry on the very top of my sign, and I'm only going to be using the Merry part of this stencil that you see here. So I just centered that at the very top of my sign and then used some painter's tape on each side to hold it into place. I then started placing my letters that spell out the word Christmas right underneath the word Merry. I just want to make sure that those are centered in the middle of my sign before I tape them down. So once I have a couple of them, or a couple of the letters placed in the center, I then use some painter's tape on each side of the letters. And I just continued this step over and over until I had all of my letters to spell Christmas in the middle of my wood plank. Now that I have all of my stencils in place, I'm going to be painting over them. And for the word Merry, I'm using my Dollar Tree stencil brush, and then I'm also using my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Tuscan Red. I really love this color red because it's a little bit of a deeper red, and I really like that color for rustic Christmas decor. So once I have the word Merry all painted over, then I'm starting on my letters, and for those I'm doing with this same Tuscan Red color. And when I'm stenciling, I like to build up the color instead of using a ton of paint all at one time. You do get more bleed through with the more paint that's on your brush, so it's a good tip to use less paint and then just build that color up. I did have a little bit of a gap between each one of my letters, so I just went ahead and put some painter's tape over top of that gap so that I didn't get any of that red color on the base of my sign. And then once I was done painting each letter, I just pulled that painter's tape back up. Once I had everything all painted, I then started removing my stencils from my sign. You do want to wait for the paint to completely dry, just in case there was any on the stencil and you moved it around. It might get on the base of your sign and then leave red onto your white, which I kind of did. I didn't wait completely for the bottom of some of my letters to dry, and I smudged a little bit of my paint, so just make sure that you let that dry before removing the stencil. Next, I'm going to be using this Merry stencil once again, but I'm going to be using the bells and flowers that are on the stencil on the very bottom of my sign, right underneath the letter S. And for this, I'm using my Dollar Tree stencil brush, and I'm using the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Rich Black. I kind of wish I would have left this one red as well, but I didn't, so I just used that rich black color and I filled it all in with the paint. Once that was dry, I then pulled back the stencil. Because I wanted my sign to look a little bit more rustic, I used my truffle colored chalk paint from Waverly on a chip brush, and I dry brushed that color around all of the edges, and then I lightly painted that on the very front of my sign, going in vertical motions. And then, since this sign will be used outdoors, I'm using my Rust-Oleum Clear Matte Protective Sealer, and I'm just spraying this over the sign, and I did do a few different coats of this so that it stays nice and new looking and it'll hold up in the cold weather. And here is my Merry Christmas porch sign all finished. This one was super easy to do, and I really love those stencils that I picked up from Amazon. They were really inexpensive, so if you guys are interested in those, I will have them linked down in the description box. I really wish I could have paired this with some of my outdoor Christmas trees, but it is a little early and I don't want my new neighbors to think I'm crazy just yet. And now for DIY number 2, I'm making rustic tabletop trees. For this one, I'm using a scrap piece of wood that is 7 inches by 3 1/4 inch, and I'm using my Craftsmart wood stain in the color brown, and I just put that on a piece of paper towel and I'm applying it to my entire piece of wood. I'm doing the front, the back, and all of the sides as well. Next, I'm taking these 3 unfinished wooden ornaments that I picked up from Michael's. These are the Art Minds brand, and they were $1.99 a piece. And I picked them up in the section of the store at the very front by the registers where they have a lot of their inexpensive items. I'm just removing the tags off of the back of all 3 of them, and then I'm also removing the jute hanger that's on all of the trees. But I did leave in the little staple that was on the back side because it was in there pretty well and you're really not going to see it anyway. So once I had my trees all prepped, I then started painting one of them with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory, and I only did 1 coat of this paint, but I did paint the front, the back, and all of the sides of this tree. Then I painted the second tree with my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Spanish Moss, and again, just 1 coat of that paint. And then for the third tree, I'm painting it with a Folk Art chalk paint in the color Tuscan Red. Now that my paint has dried on all 3 of my trees, I'm then using a piece of sandpaper to give them a more rustic look. You could skip this step if you're not really into the rustic look, but I really like that look. So I'm just using my sandpaper to sand away all of the paint around the edges, and then I just randomly sanded along the front side of the tree to give it that distressed rustic look. And I continued that same step for the red tree and then also the green tree as well. Now it's time to assemble everything together. I'm placing the white tree in the center of my stained piece of wood. To attach it, I'm using some hot glue on the very bottom of the tree, and then I'm just holding that into place until the glue completely dries. I'm then taking my other two trees and just kind of seeing exactly where I want them to be placed behind the white tree before I start gluing them down. And to attach them, I did them the same way I did the white tree. I just placed some hot glue on the bottom of each tree and then held them into place until the glue dried. To add a little bit more detail to my trees, I'm using some of these unfinished wooden stars that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. They are the Woodpile brand. To attach them to my trees, I placed hot glue on the back side of each star and then just stuck them right onto the tops of all three of my trees. And here are my finished rustic tabletop trees. I think they turned out super cute and they are just so simple. If you wanted to, you could add a little bit more of embellishments on the trees, but I really love the simplicity of these. Now moving right on into DIY number 3, I'm making a Merry Christmas tabletop sign. I'm using one of these square signs from Dollar Tree. This had the little circle thing that says "Welcome to the Jungle" in the middle, but it was already popped off. I'm not going to be using it for this project, so it worked out well that it was already popped off. And I'm just painting the very back of this square sign with my folk art chalk paint in the color Rich Black, but I'm being really careful around all of the inside edges because I want those to stay that natural wood look. I'm also going to be using these wood words that say Merry Christmas. I picked these ones up from the Target dollar spot last year. I'm not sure if they're going to have them again this year or not, but I had these ones left over from last year, so I figured why not use them. I'm painting them with my Waverly paint in the color Ivory, and I only had to do one coat of paint on both of the words. Another piece I'm going to be using in this project is this Burlap Reindeer. I did get this from Hobby Lobby. It came in a pack of Burlap Reindeer ornaments. This is part of their Christmas shop and it was $2.99 and then I got half off of that, so really inexpensive for how many you get. I'm just cutting off the little hanger on the ornament because I'm not going to be needing that. And then to attach my reindeer, I'm using hot glue on the back side and then just pressing that down right in the center of my square sign. Next, I'm placing my words Merry Christmas that I've already painted on top of my reindeer. The words that I have already had like a sticky adhesive on the back side because they were wooden stickers. So I just peeled that backing off and then stuck the words down over top of the reindeer and just made sure that I pressed those on there very well. You could always use hot glue to attach them. Next, I'm using some of this greenery from the floral Christmas stems that I picked up from Walmart. I cut the little green leaves off pretty small and then I used some hot glue on the back side of the leaves and then just attached those on the inside edge of my square sign. I'm also going to be using some of these pine cones from Dollar Tree. These are the little scented pine cones and they actually are not too overpowering, so that's really nice. I placed hot glue on the bottom side of the pine cone and then just pressed that down over top of the green leaves. And then I added a few more leaves and pine cones to each side of the bottom of my square sign. By adding the greenery and the pine cones, I feel like it gave my sign just the right amount of detail, and then the pine cones really added the rustic feel that I was going for. And this is my Merry Christmas tabletop sign all finished. This one, again, super easy to do and really inexpensive to make as well. And now for the fourth and final DIY today, I'm making a rag tree. For this one, I'm using 3 different colors of fabric. I really loved the print on all 3 of these. These ones I picked up from Michael's and they were $2.29 a piece. I know that you can get fat quarters just like this or similar to this at pretty much any craft store, and I think Dollar Tree even carries fat quarters. I know Walmart's are a little bit cheaper. They have them for I think like $1.49 a piece. Once I have my fabric tags all off, I just laid them out flat and then I started cutting each fabric into strips. I'm not using the entire fat quarters for this project, just a few strips of each fabric color. I cut the strips in about, I would say, an inch in thickness. They don't have to be exact because you're really not going to be able to tell once they're around your tree. And then I cut them in half as well, and I would say that the strips were probably an inch in thickness by probably 8 inches in length. So I did that with the green color. I also did the same thing with the red color fabric and then also the white color fabric as well. Next, I'm taking this wood piece that I also picked up from Michael's, and I'm not really sure what that piece is called. If you guys know what that's called, please let me know in the comments down below. And I'm using a 1/4 inch dowel, and that 1/4 inch dowel fits perfect in the hole on that wood piece, so it worked out really nicely. I'm placing hot glue inside of that hole and then placing the dowel inside of that wood piece just to attach the two together. I'm then starting to make my tree. I did leave a few inches of the dowel showing from the bottom of that base, like what's going to be my tree base. And then I started tying each strip of fabric around the dowel. I started with the red one, then I did the white, then the green, and I kept rotating between all 3 colors. And when I tied each strip around, I did knot them. And then as I was tying each strand onto my wooden dowel, I kept the knots all going in the same direction. This is just going to give my tree a little bit of a more clean look. Even though it's a rag tree and it's kind of all over the place, I wanted to keep all of my knots in the same place. For the top around my tree, I'm using another one of these pine cones from Dollar Tree. I placed hot glue on the bottom of the pine cone and then just held that into place on the top of my tree until the glue was all dry. Originally, I was just going to have the unfinished wood look for the stem and base of my tree, but then I changed my mind, so I'm applying some of this Craft Smart wood stain in the color brown on the wooden dowel, which is the stem of my tree, or the tree trunk, I guess you could say, and I just used a piece of paper towel to apply that. Then for the base, I'm painting that with a Waverly paint in the color Ivory. And once that ivory color was all dry, I then took some of my truffle color chalk paint from Waverly, and I'm using just this little fan brush. This is just a brush I had laying around. And I'm using a little bit more paint around all of the grooves, and then for the rest of the base piece, whatever was left over on my brush, I just very lightly dry brushed that to give that base a rustic, distressed look. And here you have my rag tree all finished. Again, such a simple and easy project. And what I love about this one is you can switch up the colors of fabric to make it fit with your own decor. Starting off with DIY number 1, the materials I used to make this were 3 2x6 pieces of wood and 2 16.5 by 2.5 pieces of wood. Merry Christmas blocks from Hobby Lobby, Waverly chalk paint in plaster, folk art chalk paint in Imperial and also in Java, folk art wood tint in gray, paintbrushes, an old washcloth, mini clothespins from Dollar Tree, jute, my hot glue gun, scissors, Christmas stems from Michael's, pine cones from Dollar General, and my hammer. To start this project out, I'm painting my 2x6 pieces of wood with my chalk paint in the color plaster. I only had to do 1 coat of this paint, and I made sure that I painted along all of the edges as well. I also painted my 2 16.5 by 2.5 pieces of wood with that same chalk paint in the color plaster, and I only did 1 coat of the paint. After all of my paint has completely dried, I'm then taking my old washcloth in this wood tint in the color gray, and I'm applying it to all of my pieces of wood. And when I'm applying it, I'm going in the same direction. I'm wiping everything in a horizontal motion, not vertical. I want the wood tint to go all in the same direction. This is going to give me a nice stained finish or stained look finish. I'm applying it just like you would if you were using a wood stain, only I'm not wiping any of it off. I'm just applying it and then leaving it sit to dry. And I did only apply one coat of the wood tint, and once that was completely dried, I'm then taking my chalk paint in the color Java and I'm dry brushing that around all of the edges of all of my wood. I'm focusing on just the edges so that I can have a nice weathered look to all of my wood pieces. Next, I'm painting all of my wooden block letters that I picked up from Hobby Lobby with my chalk paint in the color Imperial, and I did only have to do one coat of this paint, and I left all of the edges of my letters the original stain color that they came in. I'm also painting the mini clothespins from Dollar Tree with that same Imperial colored chalk paint, and I think I did about 10 of them, but you can do as many of them as you want depending on how many Christmas cards you're going to be using on your holder. Next, I'm assembling all of my wood pieces together. I'm doing the 3 larger ones on the bottom and then placing the 2 shorter ones on top of those on the ends, and then measuring to make sure that I've placed them at a 1/2 inch in. I'm then keeping my wood nice and straight, lifting it up, and then just placing some hot glue down to attach it. And don't mind my husband's hand, I didn't realize he was in the shot. And I'm doing the same thing on the other side to attach the top piece of wood, just placing some hot glue down and then pressing the wood over top. To make sure that all of my wood pieces stay attached really well, I'm adding nails on the back side of my 3 large pieces of wood. I'm doing 2 nails on the ends of each board. Next, I'm attaching my words Merry Christmas, and I'm just using this envelope to help me keep a nice straight line with all of my letters. I couldn't find my ruler, so this is all I had for my straight edge, and I'm just placing some hot glue on the back of each letter and then pressing it down onto the wood to attach it. I'm taking some of this greenery off of my Christmas stems, and then I'm hot gluing them in the center of my wood above my words Merry Christmas. I'm also using some hot glue to attach 3 pine cones right in the center of the greenery that I just applied. I'm doing the largest pine cone in the middle and then the 2 smaller ones on the sides. Now I'm taking a piece of jute and I'm wrapping it around the top of my wood underneath my words Merry Christmas in a diagonal shape, and then I'm hot gluing the ends of the jute on the back side of my wood and then just cutting off any of the extra long jute ends. I'm continuing to add more pieces of jute on the front of my wood the same way that I did the first piece of jute, only I'm crisscrossing the jute on the front of my wood, and then to attach the jute ends on the back, I'm hot gluing them the same way that I did the first piece of jute. For the last step in this DIY, I'm adding all of my painted clothespins to my jute. This is my Christmas card holder all finished. I love how it turned out, and it really wasn't that difficult to make. I know that I'm going to be using this for years to come. Now moving right on into DIY number 2, the materials I used for this project were a stocking that I already have at home, a drill, Christmas stems from Michaels, my hot glue gun, scissors, jute, a pen, 3-inch burlap ribbon from Hobby Lobby, fabric from Hobby Lobby, also wood slices from Hobby Lobby. To start this project out, I'm placing my stocking that I already have at home on top of the fabric that I picked up from Hobby Lobby, and I'm going to be using my old stocking as a guide. I'm taking a pen and then just tracing around the stocking. Now that I have my stocking all traced, I'm using my scissors to cut my fabric along all of the traced lines. Next, I'm using my stocking shape that I just made to make another stocking shape, only this time I've flipped it in the opposite direction. Luckily for me, both sides of my fabric are the same, but this would be really important if both sides of your fabric were not the same. So I'm just taking my pen and tracing around the entire stocking. Once I have all of that traced, I'm using my scissors once again to cut out my fabric. I've placed both of my stocking shapes together, and now I'm going to be attaching them using some hot glue. I'm placing the hot glue right on the inside edge and then just pressing it together on the glue. I'm continuing to glue both stocking shapes together until I get to the very top, and I'm obviously leaving that open so that I'm able to use it as a stocking. Now it's time to flip the stocking inside out, or actually right side out, because this is going to be the outside of the stocking, and then I'm just adjusting the fabric along the foot-toe part of the stocking. I'm folding over the top edges of my stocking going inward, and I'm hot gluing them down about a 1/2 inch, and I'm doing this on both sides all around. Next, I'm measuring out my burlap ribbon around the very top of my stocking. I'm measuring the length of it a little bit longer than the width of my stocking, so I'm able to fold over the edges. I'm measuring out a second piece of ribbon because I'm going to have 2 of them on the top of my stocking. Next, I'm attaching my burlap ribbon to the very top of my stocking. As you can see here, I've lined up the top of my ribbon with the very top of my stocking, and I've placed it in the middle, and now I'm just folding over my ribbon over top of my stocking, and then I'm folding over the edges of my burlap ribbon and hot gluing them down. And then to make sure that all of the ribbon is nice and secure, I'm placing a little bit of hot glue underneath the ribbon and pressing it down onto my fabric. I'm continuing those same steps for my second piece of ribbon right underneath my first piece of ribbon. Next, I'm making my hanger for my stocking. I've cut out about a 3 by 6 inch piece of my fabric, and then I'm hot gluing the edges down to give them a cleaner look. I'm then folding this piece of fabric in half and gluing it together. I'm then gluing both ends of this fabric together to form my hanger. To attach the hanger to my stocking, I'm placing some hot glue on the inside edge and then placing the hanger over top. I really like the idea of using wood slices as name tags on my stockings, so here I'm drilling a small hole at the very top of my wood slices so that I'm able to string them onto the top of my stockings. Next, I'm taking a long piece of jute and wrapping it around the top of my stocking right in between those 2 pieces of burlap ribbon. I'm then stringing my jute through the top of my wood slice and then wrapping that around the very top of my stocking and then tying it off in the back. I also wanted to add some greenery, so here I'm just picking off some of the greeneries from these Christmas stems. I'm attaching the greenery on the front of my stocking underneath the wood slice, and to do that I'm using some hot glue. And for the very last step, I'm using a marker to write the name of the person whose stocking it is right on the wood slice. These are the stockings all finished. I'm so happy with how they turned out, and they were really easy to do. By switching out the fabric and ribbon color, these stockings would go with any style decor. For DIY number 1, I'm making a pinecone wreath. For this one, I'm using an 8-inch wreath form from Dollar Tree, and I'm going to be using the back side of the wreath form as the front side of my wreath. And I'm also using some of these pine cones that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. What I first started doing was just laying out all of my pine cones onto my wreath form to see exactly how I want them to be before I start attaching them. And what I ended up doing was doing a large pine cone, then right next to that one I would do a smaller one, then a larger one, then a smaller one, and just switch those up all the way around the wreath form. Once I had it all figured out how I wanted to have them placed, then I started attaching them to my wreath form. And to do that, I'm just placing hot glue on the back side of each pine cone and then pressing it down onto the wire wreath form. After I had all of my pine cones attached to the front of my wreath, I then started attaching some of this greenery that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. This is part of their Christmas florals, and it's already pulled off of the stem because my son got a hold of it in the car and decided to just pick it all apart. I did end up cutting each little piece of greenery down so that they were shorter for me to place in between each pine cone. And to attach them, I just placed some hot glue on the ends of each stem and then just pressed those down in between each cone. After I had that greenery attached all the way around, I'm then flipping my wreath over, and now I'm going to be attaching that same greenery on the back side of each pine cone so that I have the greenery going all the way around the wreath and not just in between the cones, which I wish I would have just placed the greenery on the wreath form before I put on the pine cones, but I didn't, so I'm doing it this way. But if you are going to make this wreath, just keep that in mind that you can just do the greenery first and then do the pine cone on top of the greenery, maybe just to save yourself this extra step. Next, I'm going to be adding a second kind of greenery to my wreath. I really love this one because it has the white tips on it, and I think by adding the second kind, it's just really going to add so much more to my wreath. And to attach it, I'm doing the same thing I did with the other. I'm just cutting it down a little bit to make it fit better, and then just hot gluing it in between each pine cone. This, I believe, is either from Joann Fabrics or Michaels, and I did get it last year, but usually they have the same things every year or very similar, so you should be able to pick something up similar pretty much anywhere. I guess you could probably get stuff like this at Dollar Tree as well. But once I had all of it attached in between each pine cone, I wanted to place it on the inside too to cover up some of that wire that you could see from my wreath form. And again, just did it the same way as I did the other ones, just cut it down and hot glued it going all the way along the inside of the wreath form. Originally, I was going to use one of these black and red buffalo check bows from Dollar Tree on the very top of my wreath, but I ended up not using it because I thought this wreath just needed to be a little bit more simple. So what I ended up doing was just adding a piece of jute to the very top as my hanger. And here is my pinecone wreath all finished. I absolutely love how this one turned out. And what was even better, it is super affordable to create, and I'm going to be able to use it all through winter, not just with my holiday decor. Moving into DIY number 2, I'm making a mini tree shadow box. For this one, I used one of these wooden plaques, and I got this one from Michaels. You can either use it with a flat side or like a shadow box like I'm going to be doing. I'm also going to be using some mini trees. These ones are from the Target dollar spot for $1. You get 4 of them, but as you'll see later, I ended up using ones from Dollar Tree. I started out by staining my wood plaque with my Craft Smart wood stain in the color brown. This is a water-based stain and it dries super fast. I just love it so much. You guys will see me use it in a lot of my projects. To get in around all of the inside edges of the shadow box, it was kind of hard for me to apply it with just a towel. So what I ended up doing was just taking an old paintbrush, and then I would paint the stain on the inside, and then once I had it all painted on, I just took my towel and rubbed it around and wiped the excess stain off. Now that the plaque's all stained, I'm moving on. These are the trees from Dollar Tree I'm going to be using, but the ones from the Target dollar spot are also a great option if you can't find the ones from Dollar Tree. And I'm also using these wood beads with letters, and I'm spelling out the word Tree Farm. This pack, for some reason that I picked up, did not have a letter M in it, which was really strange to me, so I ended up just flipping over the W to create my M. Next, I'm taking 3 of those trees and I'm attaching them on the inside of my wood plaque. To attach them, I'm placing hot glue on the bottom of each tree and then just pressing them down on the inside edge. Now I'm stringing all of my wood beads that spell out the word Tree Farm onto a piece of jute. I'm starting with the word farm. I'm stringing all of those beads on first. Once I have those on, I'm then making a knot in my jute on each side of the word farm. So right next to the letter F, I'm doing a knot, and then right next to the letter M, I'm doing a knot. Once I have that all done, then I'm stringing all of my wood beads that spell out the word tree in front of the word farm. Once I have that on, then I'm placing a knot right in front of the letter T for the word tree. Next, I'm taking my piece of jute with all of my beads and I'm stringing that along the very top of my wood plaque above my trees. I'm just wrapping that piece of jute around the backside and attaching it with some hot glue so that my beads are going along the front of my plaque and that my words Tree Farm are centered above my 3 bottle brush trees. And that was the last step for this project. So simple, and it only took me a few minutes to create. What I love about this one, it is the perfect size for any tiered tray. Moving on into DIY number 3, I'm making a Merry Christmas sign. For this one, I'm using this sign that I picked up from the Target dollar spot. I did just get this sign, and it is part of the Holiday 2020 collection. What I love about this is it's already painted, so that's a step I can skip. And then I'm also using this Merry Christmas stencil from Hobby Lobby, and I'm just cutting that down a little bit so that it will fit in the center of my sign. I did get this last year. Obviously, you guys can see I've already used it, but they do have it again this year, and I believe with the 50% off that they have for the holiday stuff, it was only like $1. So I'm just using some painter's tape to attach it in the center of my sign so that it doesn't move around when I'm stenciling. And then for the color that I'm stenciling the Merry Christmas words, it is the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Rich Black. And I'm using a Dollar Tree stencil brush to do this. And for the paint, I'm actually not using a ton of paint for this. I want my words to be kind of like distressed looking, so that if they are not like fully covered with the black, it will look a little bit more rustic, and that is the look that I'm going for today. After I had my words all stenciled on, I did wait for the paint to dry before I peeled off my stencil. Next, I'm adding one of these holiday picks from Hobby Lobby. Again, their holiday stuff is 50% off. I think through the whole season every year. I did want this to be a little bit shorter, so I just cut off that long stem with some cutters. And because that holiday pick from Hobby Lobby did not have a bell on it, I really wanted to use this bell that was on one of the picks from Walmart. So I just cut the bell off, and then I'm hot gluing it onto the pick that I had got from Hobby Lobby that I'm going to be using on my sign today. Next, I'm attaching that holiday pick to the top left-hand corner of my sign. To attach it, I just placed hot glue right onto the sign and then pressed the pick on top of the glue. I did have to use a pretty good amount of glue just since this one was a little bit more heavy. Once I had that attached, I did end up adding some extra pieces of greenery around where you could see like where I'd cut the end of the stem off, and then some of these small pine cones from Dollar Tree. I thought by adding a rope to the very top of the sign as my hanger would add a little bit more of a rustic feel to this sign, even though it already has a hanger on the back of the sign. So what I did is just use some of this nautical rope from Dollar Tree. I cut it down to size, and then I hot glued each end of that rope on the back side of my sign. This is my Merry Christmas sign all finished. I think it is so cute and definitely has that rustic feel that I love so much, and it was super simple to create, especially since the sign was already painted. For today's first DIY, the materials I used were green, tan, and white felt sheets, all from Walmart, 3 different size pine tree images that I printed from my computer, my hot glue gun, 6-inch dowels from Dollar Tree, 12-inch dowels from Hobby Lobby, Waverly chalk paint in plaster, Folk Art chalk paint in Java, paintbrushes, scissors, and wood slices that came in a pack from Hobby Lobby. To start this project, I'm cutting all 3 of my printed pine trees out, and I am cutting the trunk of the tree off since I won't be using it for this project, and I'll also have all 3 of these printables down below in the description box. Next, I'm using the largest tree cutout, and I'm folding that right in half. And then I'm folding my green felt sheet in half and placing my folded tree printout right onto the felt but along the folded edge. And then I'm taking 3 little pins and just pinning my tree onto the felt so that it doesn't move around once I start cutting. You don't have to use the pins, I just thought it would make it a little bit easier. Now that I have everything all pinned, I'm cutting out the felt along my tree. And after I have all of my felt cut, I'm then removing the pins from my tree. And now repeating the same steps as I did to make my first green felt tree, I'm folding the green felt in half and then placing my folded printed tree right onto the folded edge of my green felt. And I'm using 3 small pins to pin my tree into place so that it's nice and secure when I'm cutting. And then I'm just cutting out the felt along the edges of the tree. And then once all of my felt is cut out, I'm removing all of the pins. And now I'm continuing those same steps as I did to make my green felt trees, to make my white medium-sized felt tree, and then also my small tan colored felt tree. Next up, I'm folding my green felt tree in half, and then while it's folded in half, I'm placing some hot glue on the outer folded edge at the very top, and then I'm pressing that onto my 12-inch dowel rod. To finish attaching my folded tree, I'm placing some hot glue right onto the dowel and then pressing that folded center part of my tree right on the hot glue to fully attach it. I'm continuing this same step over and over again until my dowel is completely covered in my green felt trees, and I did use 6 felt cutout trees for this. And I used all of those same steps to do my medium white felt trees and then also my small tan felt trees. Once I have all of my felt glued on, I was going to leave the dowels this unfinished wood color, but I decided I wanted to have them painted, so I'm painting them with my Java colored chalk paint with just a little bit of paint on my brush and then just running it over the dowel to give it kind of like a distressed real tree trunk look. It would have been easier if I would have painted these in the beginning, but like I said, I thought I wanted to have them unfinished, but afterward I decided to have them painted. Next, I'm drilling holes into 3 of my wood slices. 2 of the holes are going to be a little bit larger to fit the larger 12-inch dowels that I used for my large and medium tree, and then my smaller tree that I used the 6-inch dowel, it's a little bit thinner, so I did a smaller drill bit, and I measured the drill bit by matching it up to the size of the dowel. And for the last step, I'm placing some hot glue in the holes that I just drilled and then placing the dowels right inside of the holes on top of the glue. This is going to help all of the trees stay nice and sturdy, and I did this for the small, medium, and large trees. These are my trees all finished. I'm so happy with how they turned out, and they were so easy to make. What's great about these is you can use them in your winter decor, not just for Christmas. Now moving right on into DIY number 2, the materials I used for this project were 3 house-shaped wooden pieces from Michaels, music note paper from Hobby Lobby, Waverly chalk paint in ink and also in plaster, folk art acrylic paint in Old Ivy, matte Mod Podge, paintbrushes, a sponge brush, sandpaper, scissors, jute, a black permanent marker from Dollar Tree, painter's tape, these mini Christmas ornaments from Walmart, Christmas stems from Walmart, my hot glue gun, letter stickers from Hobby Lobby, and burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree. To start this project out, I'm placing one of my house-shaped wooden blocks on top of my music note paper and then tracing around it. Once I have it all traced, I'm using some scissors to cut it out. Next, I'm painting all of the sides of this wooden house with my chalk paint in the color ink, and I only had to do 1 coat of this paint. Once that paint has completely dried, I'm then using some Mod Podge on the front of my wooden house, and I'm applying it using the sponge brush, and I probably used a little bit more Mod Podge than I needed, but it worked out fine. I'm then applying my cutout music note paper right on top of that wet Mod Podge, and then rubbing out any of the bubbles with my fingers. After the Mod Podge has dried about 15 minutes or so, I'm taking some more Mod Podge and applying it on the front of my music note paper just to make sure that it's attached nice and secure, and then letting that dry for another 15 minutes before I'm taking some sandpaper and then just sanding off any of the edges or overlapping music note paper. Originally, I was going to have the sides of this house distressed, but after I was done sanding, I decided I wanted to have them really crisp and black, so I'm going back in with my ink colored chalk paint once again and just touching up any spots that had got sanded off when I was sanding off the edges of my paper. Now you're going to be seeing the back of this house. Originally this is the look I was going for, but I ended up not liking it, so this is now the back of the house. But I just put some hot glue on the back and applied some jute to it to attach it, and then I'm just wrapping the jute around the house about 5 or 6 times so that I have a nice thick line of jute at the top, and then I'm hot gluing it again on the back and then just cutting off the ends of the jute. Next, I'm taking this Merry Farmhouse Christmas mini ornament from my pack of mini ornaments from Walmart, and I'm stringing a piece of jute through it, and then just taking that piece of jute, stringing it underneath the jute that's wrapped around my house, and then tying it off in a knot and cutting off any of the extra long jute ends. That was the last step for that mini house. Now I'm going to be moving on to a second house, and for this one I'm painting the entire thing in my chalk paint in the color plaster, and I did 2 coats of this paint. Now I'm placing some painter's tape right in the center of this house and then applying another piece of tape right above that one, leaving a small space in between, and then continuing that on the top of the house and then also on the bottom of the house, leaving a small space in between all of the tape. Now I'm using my chalk paint in the color ink, and I'm painting that in between all of the open spaces between my tape. I'm putting just a small amount of paint on my brush since I want all of my lines to be very distressed. Once all of that's painted on, I'm peeling off all of my tape. And for the very last step on this house, I'm using all lowercase letters from my letter pack from Hobby Lobby, and I'm spelling out the word Noel. I'm placing those stickers in the very bottom right corner. Now I'm moving on to my third and final wooden house. For this one, I'm painting it in my acrylic paint in the color Old Ivy, and I did 2 coats of this paint. Once that paint has completely dried, I'm then using my chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I'm dry brushing that around all of the edges, the sides, and the front of my house. Now I'm measuring my burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree around the front of my house and then just cutting that down to size. And as you'll see here, I went ahead and painted the back of my house because I didn't like how it looked unfinished. And then I'm just hot gluing that burlap ribbon onto the back of my house. Next, I'm taking a piece of jute and I'm wrapping it around my 2 fingers quite a few times to form a circle. And this is going to be the wreath that I'm placing on the very front of my house. And then I'm hot gluing my little jute wreath at the very top in the center of my house and using just a little bit of hot glue in a few different places to make sure that it's all nice and secure and glued down. I'm cutting some of this greenery from my Christmas stems from Walmart, and then I'm cutting the greenery down into small sections so that it's easier for me to glue on top of my wreath. To attach the greenery to the jute wreath, I'm putting some hot glue right onto the jute and then pressing the greenery right onto the hot glue to attach it. And I found that it works best if you work in small sections so that it doesn't look overcrowded and you can still see some of that jute popping through. I'm taking a doubled piece of jute and I'm making a small bow out of it. I'm cutting off the long ends, and to attach it to the very top of my wreath, I'm using a little bit of hot glue. And the last step for this house, I'm attaching this wooden word that says bright that I got in a pack of words from the Target dollar spot. I'm placing some hot glue in a few places on the back of the word and then pressing that on my burlap ribbon. These are my houses all finished. I love how they turned out. Each and every one of these houses is a little bit different from each other, but all of them would work great with any farmhouse decor. The first DIY for today is this wooden snowman. And for this project, I used the Decor Art chalk paint in the color Lace, Folk Art chalk paint in the color Java and also in Imperial, Waverly chalk paint in the color Pumpkin, paintbrushes, 3 different size pieces of wood that I got in a bag of wood at Hobby Lobby, burlap fabric, buffalo check ribbon, a top hat ornament from Dollar Tree, branches from a tree, or you can also buy these at any craft store, my hot glue gun, a Sharpie pen, Christmas picks from Dollar Tree, and 2 black buttons. I'm starting out by painting all 3 of my wood pieces with my chalk paint in the color Lace. I did have to do 2 coats of this paint to get it to cover completely. After my paint has completely dried, I'm then taking my chalk paint in the color Java and I'm dry brushing this around all of the edges of my wood pieces. I'm only doing it on the edges to give them a rustic look. Once I have everything painted, I'm then going in with my Sharpie pen and drawing on my snowman's eyes. I'm then painting on my snowman's nose using the Waverly chalk paint in the color Pumpkin. I'm using the Sharpie pen once again to draw on his mouth. To give my snowman some rosy cheeks, I'm dry brushing that Imperial color in a circular motion right above the corners of his mouth. To put my snowman together, I'm putting hot glue on the piece I'm using for the middle, and then I'm just pushing it right onto the bottom piece. And then I'm taking the head of my snowman, putting some hot glue on the bottom of him, and placing him on the middle piece. I'm attaching 2 small black buttons on the middle wood piece using some hot glue. I probably should have worn gloves for this because I was burning my fingers. For my snowman's arms, I'm going to be using some branches, and I'm just breaking them down for a smaller size so that his arms aren't so long. To attach my branches, I'm using some hot glue on the sides of my middle piece, and I am holding it in place until the glue is completely dried so that they don't move around. I'm cutting a strip from my burlap fabric because I'm going to be using this for my snowman scarf. I'm wrapping it around the top block and then just tying it in a knot. To secure my fabric, I'm using a little bit of hot glue on both sides. I decided I wanted to add a little bit of color, so here I'm adding a buffalo check ribbon around the burlap fabric, just tying that around his neck in a knot and then cutting off the extra long ends. I'm taking the top piece of my ornament out of my top hat, and for the very last step to attach the hat, I'm putting some hot glue on the top of my snowman's head and then just pressing the hat over top. And this is my finished snowman. I think he's absolutely adorable and he was so easy to make. Since we're done with this DIY, let's move on to the next projects for today. I'll be showing you 2 different trees. There's a burlap tree, and I'll also be showing you this rag ribbon tree. For these projects, I'll be using 2 3x7 floral foam cones from Dollar Tree, craft paper, berry garland from Dollar Tree, burlap fabric, ticking fabric, my hot glue gun, and Christmas floral from Dollar Tree. To start out, I'm taking my craft paper and measuring it around my cone and then cutting the paper down to size. I'm going to be using the paper on both of my cones, so I went ahead and did the same thing for the other one as well. I'm now attaching the paper to my cone using some hot glue. I'm just putting the glue right on the cone and then pressing the paper over top to attach it, and then rolling the paper around the cone and then just hot gluing any of the end pieces down. By adding the paper, it's going to help my fabric stick on a lot better than if I were just adding it to the foam. For the ends, I'm folding in the paper as if you were wrapping a present and then hot gluing the end pieces down. Next, I'm cutting a piece of my burlap fabric about 6 inches wide, and then I'm folding that in half and measuring it around the bottom of my cone before I cut off the excess. While still holding my fabric in half, I'm cutting 1.5 to 2 inch thick strips about 3/4 of the way up. I'm now going to be attaching my fabric using some hot glue. I'm just placing the hot glue right on the cone and then putting the fabric over top of that and doing that all the way around. I'm continuing by doing the same steps over and over again, folding my 6-inch piece of fabric in half and then measuring it around my tree, cutting off the excess, and then while holding my fabric folded, I'm cutting about 2-inch thick strips about 3/4 of the way up. Again, to attach the fabric, I'm placing hot glue right on the cone and then the fabric over top of that. Once I have all of my burlap strips on and I've come to the top of my cone, I'm taking some hot glue and putting it right on top of the craft paper and then just pushing with a paintbrush the burlap over top. I'm then going to be using one of the pine cones from my Dollar Tree floral picks and attaching it to the top of my cone using some hot glue. Next, I'm making a double bow with my ribbon. I'm zigzagging the ribbon through my 2 fingers, and then I'm pulling the end ribbon piece through the hole between my 2 fingers closest to my hand, taking that outer ribbon piece and then putting it through the loop on my lower finger and then pulling the end ribbon piece tight. I'm cutting the end pieces of my ribbon off and then hot gluing that right on the top of my cone underneath my pine cone. And for the last step, I'm wrapping this berry garland around my tree, and since it does have a wire inside of it, I'm just wrapping it around and I don't have to glue it or anything to attach it. And this is the tree all finished. I just love how it turned out. Now I'm going to be showing you how I created this rag tree. To start out, I'm cutting my burlap fabric down to 2 by 2 inch thick squares, and I did use 62 of them for this project. I'm also cutting my ticking fabric down to 2 by 2 inch thick squares, and I used 46 of them for this project. Once I have all of my squares cut, I'm then going to be attaching them to my cone. I'm pinching the fabric together and then placing some hot glue on the center of that fabric and then just simply pressing it onto the cone. For my ticking fabric, I'm pinching it together on the cream color side, applying the hot glue in the center and putting it onto my cone. I'm switching between the two fabrics as I work all the way up the cone. After a while, I started using the end of my paintbrush to apply the fabric to my cone using the glue. It was a lot better than just using my fingers because I was able to work with the fabric a little bit better this way. I'm continuing the same step of pinching the fabric in the middle, placing the hot glue on, and then attaching it to the cone over and over until my cone is completely covered in the fabric. For the last step, I'm attaching one of the pine cones from my Dollar Tree floral stems right on the top of my cone using some hot glue. And this is my finished rag tree. I think it is so cute and rustic. First up is DIY number 1, and the materials I used for this project was this standing Christmas tabletop sign from Dollar Tree, a 3-inch embroidery hoop from Michaels, wooden words from the Target Dollar Spot, Waverly chalk paint in plaster, folk art chalk paint in Java, paintbrushes, burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, painter's tape from Dollar Tree, Christmas stems from Michaels, jute, scissors, sandpaper, and my hot glue gun. For this project, I'm going to be using the back of this sign, so I'm peeling off the sticker that was on there and then just sanding off all of the sticky residue that was on there from the sticker. I want to make sure that I have a nice clean surface before I start painting. And I'm also using my scissors to pop off the little hanger that was on the sign, and then just sanding off any of the little rough edges that were on there as well. Next, I'm painting the inside of the square sign with my chalk paint in the color plaster. I did have to do 2 coats of this paint, and I also painted around all of the inside edges. Once my paint has completely dried, I'm then placing a piece of painter's tape right in the center of my painted surface. This is how I'm going to be creating my lines. And then I'm going to be placing another piece of painter's tape right above that, leaving a small space in between the 2 pieces of tape. And then just continuing that step on the bottom and then also the top so that I have it completely covered in painter's tape, leaving a space in between each piece. Now I'm dry brushing my Java colored chalk paint in between all of my pieces of painter's tape. I'm using the dry brush technique so that my lines will have a nice rustic distressed look. Once that's all painted, then I'm just peeling off each piece of painter's tape. Next, I'm using my Java colored chalk paint once again, and I'm painting around all of the outside edges of this square, and I did only have to do 1 coat of this paint. Once my paint has all dried, to distress all of the outside edges, I'm dry brushing on my plaster colored chalk paint. Next, I'm taking apart my embroidery hoop by removing the screw at the very top, and then I'm painting both of my circles with my Java colored chalk paint, and I wasn't worried about how the paint looked because I wanted them to look very distressed. Next, I'm dry brushing my plastered colored paint right onto both of my hoops. I wanted the hoops to be the same color as the outside of my square. I'm then painting the screw of my embroidery hoop with my Java colored chalk paint, and then using this Merry word from the Target Dollar Spot wood letter pack, I'm painting that in the plastered colored chalk paint, and I did have to do 2 coats of this paint to cover up the red. Next, I'm measuring and cutting out a piece of burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, and I'm placing it over top of the inner embroidery hoop and then placing the outer hoop over top of that so that I have my ribbon going throughout the middle of my hoop. And then just taking the screw and screwing it back in the very top so that I have all of my ribbon nice, tight, and secure. And I was able to move my ribbon around a little bit to make sure that it was centered exactly before I finished screwing it completely in. And originally I was going to have my ribbon hanging out of my hoop, but here I decided not to, so I'm just cutting the ribbon down as close as I can to the sides of the hoop. And now I'm cutting a small piece of this greenery from my Christmas stem, and I'm hot gluing it right in the center of my burlap ribbon. Once the greenery is all glued down, I'm then placing some hot glue right on the back side of my painted Merry word and placing that right over top of the greenery. Next, I'm stringing a doubled piece of jute through the top of my embroidery hoop screw. I'm centering the jute and then hot gluing the pieces down on the back side of my square. And hot gluing the jute onto the front edge of my square, and also the actual embroidery hoop I'm gluing down with some hot glue in the center of my square, and I'm placing the hot glue at the very top of the hoop, at the very bottom of the hoop, and then just pressing it down. And that was the last step in this DIY, and this is my finished Merry Embroidery Hoop Christmas sign. I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I think it's just a little bit different than a lot of the decor that you see out. Now that we're finished with this project, let's go ahead and move on to DIY number 2. And for this project, the materials I used were this unfinished wooden Christmas tree from Hobby Lobby, Waverly chalk paint in plaster, folk art acrylic paint in Old Ivy, folk art chalk paint in Java, paintbrushes, Rust-Oleum spray paint in oil rubbed bronze, jute, scissors, my hot glue gun, sandpaper, mini Christmas bells from Dollar Tree, wooden words from the Target Dollar Spot, and this wooden star sticker from Dollar Tree. For this project, I'm starting out by spray painting the mini Christmas bells from Dollar Tree with my Rust-Oleum spray paint in oil rubbed bronze, and I did spray 2 coats on my bells. Next, I'm painting my unfinished wooden Christmas tree that I picked up from Hobby Lobby with my folk art acrylic paint in the color Old Ivy. I did have to do 2 coats of this paint, and I made sure that I got the paint in between all of the wooden slats and on the sides of my tree. I'm then painting the trunk and the base of my tree with my chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I did have to do 2 coats of this paint. Once that paint has completely dried, I'm using my chalk paint in the color Java, and I'm dry brushing that over top of where I just painted the plaster color to give the base and the trunk of my tree a nice distressed look. Next, I'm painting this Believe word that I picked up from the Target Dollar Spot in my chalk paint color Plaster. I'm also using the word Believe, but that one was already painted white, so I didn't have to paint that one. I'm also using this wooden star sticker from Dollar Tree. I took the sticker part off of the back. The front part is all glitter, but I'm not using that side. I'm using the back wooden side, and I'm painting that in my plastered color chalk paint, and I did 1 coat of that paint and then dry brushed the Java color over top as well. And now back to my tree. I'm now using a piece of sandpaper to sand around all of the edges and the front surface of my tree. As you can see, this wooden tree has a nice texture to the wood, so anything that I'm sanding over, it's taking the paint off where all of the wood is raised, and it's giving me a nice rustic look. I'm stringing one of the painted Christmas bells onto a double piece of jute. I'm placing the jute in a diagonal shape on one of the top wooden slats of my tree, and then hot gluing the ends of the jute onto the back of my tree. Now I'm stringing 2 of the painted bells onto a double piece of jute. I'm placing this piece of jute with the bells in a diagonal shape on the center slat of my wooden tree, and then hot gluing the ends of the jute right on the back of my tree. And for the bottom slat of my tree, I'm stringing 3 of these painted bells onto a double piece of jute, placing them in a diagonal along the bottom slat, and then hot gluing the jute ends down onto the back of my tree. I decided I wanted to add some more jute on the front of my tree, so I'm adding some double pieces of jute in a diagonal shape, just like I did the ones with the bells, only this time I'm leaving the bells off, and I'm just hot gluing the ends of the jute down on the back of the tree, just like I did with the other pieces of jute, and I did 3 going across all of the ones that have the bells on them. Next, I'm hot gluing my painted star right onto the top of my tree, and I wanted to add 1 more piece of jute on the very top slat of my tree since it didn't have anything, so I'm doing this just like I did the other ones in a diagonal shape and hot gluing the jute on the back of the tree. Now to attach my words Bright and Believe, I'm using a little bit of hot glue right on my tree and then pressing the words down. I used Bright towards the top of my tree and then the word Believe towards the bottom in between the jute. And this is my tree all finished. It was so easy to do, and what I love about this project is you can switch it up to make it fit with your own decor that you have in your home by switching up the color of the tree or maybe even switching the jute for ribbon. Now that we're all finished with this DIY, let's go ahead and move on to the last and third DIY for today. For this project, I used an unfinished wooden plaque from Hobby Lobby, Waverly chalk paint in plaster and also in the color hazelnut, paintbrushes, a large sponge brush, an old toothbrush, this Christmas countdown image I created on my computer, garland ties from Dollar Tree, matte Mod Podge, white glue from Dollar Tree, a red permanent marker from Dollar Tree, and also a black permanent marker from Dollar Tree, scissors, screw eyes from Hobby Lobby, paper towel, a small bowl of water, and my hammer. I'm starting out by placing some of this white glue that I picked up from Hobby Lobby onto a white piece of printer paper. I'm then spreading out the glue with a large sponge brush into a thin layer. Once all of that glue has dried, I'm then placing it into my printer with the glue side facing to where it's going to be printed on. And then I'm printing the image that I created onto my computer onto the piece of paper that has the glue on it. And I will have the image linked down below. Next, I'm painting my wood plaque that I picked up from Hobby Lobby with my plaster color chalk paint, and I did have to do 2 coats of this paint, but I made sure that I painted around all of the edges. Once that paint had completely dried, I then am taking my Java colored chalk paint and I'm dry brushing that around all of the edges and then along the front. And when I'm painting along the front, I'm doing it in the same motion back and forth. I'm not painting up and down. To give a little bit more dimension, I'm now taking my hazelnut colored chalk paint and I'm painting that over where I just painted all of the Java colored paint, only this time I'm concentrating it a little bit more around the front edges of my plaque. Next, I'm applying some of this matte Mod Podge onto the very front of my plaque, and to spread out the Mod Podge, I'm using a large sponge brush and I'm just spreading it out into a thin layer. While the Mod Podge is still wet, I'm applying my printed image to the center of my plaque. I'm pressing down to make sure that it attaches really nicely and then just pressing out any of the bubbles with my fingers. Once my paper is attached, I'm letting it sit for 24 hours. It's now sat for 24 hours and now I'm taking a bowl of water and some paper towel to wet the paper, and once it's all saturated in water, I'm starting to peel the paper off. I'm using an old toothbrush to start to scrub some of the paper away. It was a little bit easier this way, but this is where I started to have the little mishap with this DIY. I'm not sure why, but the ink started to come off as I was scrubbing with the toothbrush. From all of the tutorials and things I've seen on this method, it's not supposed to do that. I don't know what's with me and these transfer methods. Some of them work, some of them don't, but it was worth a shot. I ended up fixing it here by using some of these Sharpies that I picked up from Dollar Tree. I had gotten all of the paper off and made sure that I didn't have any residue from the glue, and then I started writing with the red Sharpie for my words Christmas and countdown, and then once I had those all written on, I used my black Sharpie just to go over all of the numbers. If any of you have tried the Mod Podge transfer method and you saw something that I did wrong, please let me know in the comments down below so next time I can get it right. I wanted my words and my numbers to have an aged look to them, so for my words Christmas countdown, I'm dry brushing them with the Java colored paint, and then for all of my numbers, I'm dry brushing them with my plastered color chalk paint. Now I'm attaching the screw eyes that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. I'm putting them right above each number, and I'm using my hammer to hammer the tip of the screw eye in, and then just using my fingers to finish screwing them down into the wood. And I'm doing this for all 25 numbers. I'm just placing the screw eye once again right above the number, hammering the tip of the screw eye into the wood, and then finishing by screwing it in with my fingers. Now I'm cutting a small piece from one of these garland ties from Dollar Tree. This is going to be formed into my wreath, and the pine needles on this were too long, so I'm just using my scissors to cut all of the needles down. Next, I'm wrapping some of this berry garland from Dollar Tree around my trimmed garland tie, but as you'll see here in a minute, I ended up just picking all of those berries off because I didn't like the way that they looked. And then I'm just forming this garland tie into a small circle to form my wreath. And for the last step, I'm simply placing my wreath over one of the hooks for however many days it is until Christmas. And this is my Christmas countdown sign all finished. Even though it didn't turn out exactly as I had planned, I still really love how it turned out, and I'm so glad that I was able to fix it. First up is this rustic wooden block Christmas tree, and for this project I use Decor Art chalk paint in the color Lace, Folk Art chalk paint in the color Castle, Waverly chalk paint in the color Moss, paintbrushes, jute, 2 tumbling tower games from Dollar Tree, berry garland from Dollar Tree, my hot glue gun, burlap fabric, Christmas ribbon from Dollar Tree, and scissors. To start out, I'm painting 34 of my tumbling tower blocks in my chalk paint in the color Lace, and I did 1 coat of this paint. You could always use spray paint to make it a little bit easier. Then I'm painting 5 of the blocks in my chalk paint in the color Castle, and I only did 1 coat of this paint as well. Once my paint has dried, I'm then lining up my blocks to see how I want my tree, and I ended up going with 2 rows for each section of my tree. Since I'm doing 2 rows for each section of my tree, I'm hot gluing 2 blocks together, and I did this for all 34 of my white blocks. Now that I have those glued together, I'm now going to be making the bottom section of my tree by gluing 5 of these 2 block sections together. I'm placing hot glue on the sides of the blocks and then holding them together until the glue is completely dried. To make the next sections for my tree, I'm gluing 4 of these 2 block pieces together. Then I'm gluing 3 of the 2 block pieces together. I'm also gluing 2 of these pieces together, and I did this 3 different times. Now that those are all glued together, to give my tree a distressed look, I'm taking my chalk paint in the color Castle and I'm dry brushing that over all of the edges and the front of my wood pieces. You could always do this part after your sections are glued together, but I thought it was a little easier this way. Now that everything's painted, I'm going to be attaching all of my sections with some hot glue. I'm placing the hot glue on the bottom of the 4-section piece and then pressing it onto the 5-section piece to attach it. Next, I'm gluing the 3-section piece onto the 4-section, and then the 2-section piece onto the 3-section, and then gluing the 1-section piece onto the 2-section, and then I'm going to be taking another 1-section piece and gluing it vertical onto the other 1-section piece for the very top of my tree, and also gluing a 1-section piece in the center on the bottom of my 5-section piece. To make the stand for my tree, I'm gluing my castle colored blocks together. I'm gluing 3 of them in one direction and then the opposite direction for the 2 end blocks. Next, I'm attaching my tree onto the stand using some hot glue. I put the hot glue on the bottom of the tree and then just press it onto the stand. I'm cutting a small strip of burlap that I'm going to be attaching around the top of my tree. Now I'm wrapping the burlap around the top of my tree and then just tying a really loose knot and cutting off the excess burlap ends. I'm securing the burlap on the tree with a little bit of hot glue. Now I'm making a double bow. I'm zigzagging the ribbon through my fingers and then placing the end of the ribbon through the hole closest to my hand between my 2 fingers, then taking the end piece of ribbon and placing it through the loop that was around the bottom of my finger and then pulling it tight. I'm then attaching the ribbon on top of the burlap on my tree using some hot glue. I wanted a little color, so I'm adding this berry garland, and I'm just measuring 3 different sections around the top, middle, and bottom of my tree. To attach the garland, I'm flipping my tree over and placing some hot glue on the back side, placing the garland over top to attach it, then wrapping the garland around the front of the tree and bringing the opposite end to the other side and hot gluing that down. Then I'm just shaping the garland on the front the way I want it. Now I'm attaching 2 more strips of garland around the middle and the bottom of my tree, the same as I did the top strip, placing hot glue on the back side of my tree and then pressing the garland on the hot glue to attach it. Then once that's all attached, I'm shaping my garland the way I want it to be on the front of my tree. And this is my finished wooden tree. I think it is so cute and it fits perfect with a lot of my Christmas decor. Now let's move on to the next DIY, which is this wooden ornament shaped sign. For this project, I used an unfinished wooden ornament from Dollar Tree. a Happy Holidays Unfinished Ornament from Michaels, Deco Art Chalk Paint in the color Lace, Folk Art Chalk Paint in the color Castle, Waverly Chalk Paint in the color Ink and also in Crimson, paintbrushes, scissors, jute, ribbon from Dollar Tree, painter's tape from Dollar Tree, and my hot glue gun. To start this project out, I'm taking my chalk paint in the color Lace and I'm painting this over the unfinished wooden ornament, and I did have to do 2 coats of this paint. Once my paint is dried, I'm then taking a piece of painter's tape and applying it in the middle of my wooden ornament. This is going to help me keep all of my lines for my plaid really straight. I'm then using a second piece of painter's tape right next to the piece that I applied, and this is going to be used as my spacer piece. I'm then taking a third piece of painter's tape and applying it next to the tape that I just put down that I'm using as a spacer. And then once I have that all applied, I'm going to be taking off the spacer piece of painter's tape. And I'm continuing to repeat these steps until I have all of my vertical lines made with my painter's tape. After I have all of my tape applied, I'm then taking my chalk paint in the color Castle and I'm painting that in the spaces between all of the tape. And I did only do 1 coat of this paint. Once my paint has completely dried, I'm then peeling off all the pieces of painter's tape. Next, I'm going to be making my horizontal lines, and I'm going to be putting my painter's tape starting at the very bottom tip of my wooden ornament. Then I'm applying another piece of tape above that, and this is the one I'm going to be using as a spacer. After I have that one on, I'm putting another piece of tape on top of that and then peeling off the spacer tape. I'm continuing that step until I have all of my horizontal lines made. I needed a darker gray for my next color, so I'm mixing Castle and the colors Ink together to make a more darker gray, and I realized that I probably should have mixed it on paper towel, but I didn't have anything around besides this. Now I'm painting on that gray color that I just mixed up in between all of the spaces going horizontally. Next, I'm applying some more tape, and I'm going to be putting it right in the same spots that I originally did my vertical lines, and you can see in the paint right where the stripes were, so I'm just putting the tape in those same spots. After all of my tape is applied, I'm then using my chalk paint in the color Ink, and I'm painting that in all of the open space squares. Once my paint has completely dried, I'm then peeling off all of my painter's tape, all of the vertical lines and horizontal lines. I wanted to have a little bit of a distressing look to this, so I'm taking my chalk paint in the color Lace and I'm just dry brushing that right over top of all of the darker colors. Now I'm painting the words on this wooden ornament with my paint color Lace, and I made sure that I got all around the letters and edges. Since this is going to be 3D on top of the ornament, you're going to be able to see all of the edges. And then for the vines and the leaves, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Moss, and I only did 1 coat of this on the words and also on the leaves. And then for the berries, I painted them in the chalk paint color Crimson. Now I'm going to be creating my bow. I'm cutting out 3 different size pieces of ribbon, a long one, a medium one, and a small one. The long one I'm going to be leaving on the bottom, and the medium and small one I'm going to be forming into circles. Unfortunately, I did not measure these, I just went with what I thought would be a good size on my ornament. Now I'm forming my circle on my medium and small pieces of ribbon with some hot glue. I'm placing the hot glue on one end of the ribbon and then pulling the ribbon over and attaching it to the other end. To make the bow, I'm putting the medium-sized circle on top of the long piece of ribbon and then the small circle on top of the medium one. Then I'm taking a piece of jute and wrapping that right around the center of all of those. I'm cutting off the long ends of my jute and then fluffing out the material of my bow. I'm putting a piece of jute through the hole that was originally on the sign and then just measuring it how long I want it to be, tying off a knot and then cutting off the ends. I'm attaching my bow with some hot glue right on the very top of my ornament underneath the hole where the jute is. For the last step, I'm attaching this Happy Holidays ornament right in the center of my wooden ornament using some hot glue. I'm putting the hot glue along the back of the ornament and then pressing it down onto the center of my wooden ornament. And this is my finished hanging ornament. I absolutely love how this one turned out, but we do still have one more DIY for today. I'll be showing you how I created these hanging Christmas tags. For this project, I used 2 tag ornaments from Dollar Tree, this season's greeting stencil from Dollar Tree, folk art acrylic paint in Old Ivy, Deco art chalk paint in the color Lace, Rust-Oleum spray paint in oil rubbed bronze, paintbrushes, scissors, Christmas ribbon from Dollar Tree, and bells from Dollar Tree. To start out, I'm spray painting my bells with this Rust-Oleum spray paint in oil rubbed bronze. I did end up only using 2 of these bells, but now I have the other ones already painted for later. I'm not going to be using this red ribbon, so I'm cutting that off of the top and then flipping mine over because this is the side I'm going to be using. Mine did have little sticky tags on the back, so I'm just peeling those off, and then I took a piece of sandpaper and just sanded off all that sticky residue. Now I'm painting both of my tags in the color Old Ivy, and this was not a chalk paint. I didn't have a chalk paint that was this color, so I used the acrylic paint that I have, and it does take a little bit longer for it to dry, so just keep that in mind if you're using this paint. And I did have to do 2 coats of it, and I made sure that I painted around all of the edges. After my paint has completely dried, I'm then taking my chalk paint in the color Lace, and I'm dry brushing that around all of the edges of both tags. Originally, I was just going to do the dry brushing around the edges, but later decided that I wanted them to have more of a distressed look all over, so I'm dry brushing on the tops of them as well. Next, I'm centering the word Seasons on one of my tags. I'm only using the word Seasons on this tag, and I'm stenciling with my stencil brush from Dollar Tree, and the color I'm using to stencil with is my chalk paint in the color Lace. Now, you could wear gloves or not. I got paint all over my hands while doing this. I like to hold each letter down as I'm stenciling. I find it a lot easier this way, and you don't have any bleeding, and the less paint that you use, the better. You can always add more layers of paint. See how nicely that turned out? I didn't have any bleeding. And then I did the same thing for my greetings word. I just centered it onto the second tag and then just stenciled it on the same way that I did Seasons, while holding the stencil down really, really tight while I stenciled over all of my words using a little amount of paint. Now I'm taking a piece of jute and stringing on one of my painted bells. Then I'm taking the other end of the jute and putting it through the already drilled hole on my tag. I'm stringing on another bell on this piece of jute and then using the other end of the jute to put through the already drilled hole on this tag as well. Now I'm pulling together all of my strands of jute, tying them in a knot, and then cutting off any of the extra long jute ends. Next, I'm making a bow just like I did in my last DIY. I'm cutting 3 strands of this Christmas ribbon, 1 long strand, 1 medium, and 1 small, and the medium and small ones I'm going to be forming into a circle using some hot glue on one end of the ribbon and then attaching it to the other side of the ribbon. I'm placing my larger circle on top of my flat piece of ribbon, then the smaller circle on top of the larger circle, pinching all of that together and tying a piece of jute around the middle. I'm cutting off any long ends of the jute, and once I have my bow all made, I'm fluffing out the material. For the very last step, I'm going to be attaching my bow onto the jute that I'm going to be using as my hanger using some hot glue. Here are my finished hanging tags. These were so easy to make, and I loved making all of today's DIYs. These are the 2 Christmas pillows that I'll be creating today, and to make them I used 2 18 by 18 pillow covers from Hobby Lobby, an ironing board, It's the Most Wonderful Time of Year stencil from Dollar Tree, a Merry Christmas stencil from Hobby Lobby, Waverly chalk paint in the color Ink, folk art chalk paint in the color Imperial, painter's tape, a paint and stencil brush, a few scrap pieces of cardboard, 2 old throw pillows, and an iron. I've already washed my pillow covers without using fabric softener. I did not want that to affect how the paint adheres to my fabric, and now I'm just taking my iron on the hottest setting and ironing out all of the wrinkles that are on both pillow covers. Next, I'm putting a piece of cardboard inside of my pillow cover underneath where I'll be painting so that it will prevent any bleed through on the other side of my fabric. I'm going to be creating stripes on this cover, and to do that I'm placing a piece of painter's tape on the very edge of my cover. I'm getting as close to the edge as I possibly can, so I am taking my time when doing this because I want my lines to be really straight, and then I'm just taking the ends of my painter's tape and wrapping them around the edges of the cover. Now I'm applying another piece of painter's tape right next to the tape that I've already applied, and this piece is going to be used as my spacer. I'm applying a third piece of tape right next to my spacer piece and wrapping the ends of my tape around the top and bottom of my cover, just like I did the first piece of tape, and then removing the spacer piece of tape. Now I'm doing the same thing as I did on the other side. I'm placing a piece of tape on the very edge of my cover, then putting a second piece of spacer tape in between the third piece of tape, and I'm making sure that I'm folding the ends of my tape around the top and bottom of my cover. I'm then removing the spacer piece of tape and pressing down along all of my tape to make sure that it's attached nicely to my fabric. Next, I'm painting on my chalk paint in the color Imperial in between the spaces of my tape. I did do only one coat, but while I was painting it on, I was using a little bit of paint on my brush at a time and building the color up so that I wouldn't have any bleeding underneath my tape. And here I'm doing the same thing as I did on the other side, painting my Imperial color paint in between my pieces of tape. Once all of my paint has dried, I'm then peeling off all of the pieces of my painter's tape. Next, I'm placing a piece of cardboard in the center of my pillow cover because that's where I'm going to be painting next, and I want to prevent any bleed through. I'm using my Merry Christmas stencil on this cover, and here I'm just centering it in between the two lines that I just painted on, and then I'm using some painter's tape around all of the edges of the stencil to make sure that it stays in place. Next, I'm using my Dollar Tree stencil brush and my chalk paint in the color Ink, and I'm painting that over both words, Merry Christmas. Every time I use a stencil, I like to press down around the area that I'm painting. I think that this helps with any bleeding underneath of your stencil words, and I always end up with paint all over my fingers, but you could always wear a glove. I like to wait till my paint has completely dried before I peel my stencil off, so here my paint has already all dried, and now I'm just taking the stencil off. To make sure that my paint stays on, I always like to heat set all of my fabric that I ever paint on. So here I'm flipping my pillow cover inside out, and then I'm using my iron on the hottest setting and going over each section where I painted for about 20 to 30 seconds on each spot that has paint on it. Now that I have everything all heat set, I'm simply placing my old throw pillow in my new pillow cover. Now, if you don't have any old throw pillows to use, you can either buy a pack of pillow inserts, which you can get for really inexpensive on Amazon, and I'll have some linked down below, or you can even use a standard bed pillow depending on what size pillow cover you're using. This is what my Merry Christmas pillow looks like all finished. Next, I'll be showing you how I created this It's the Most Wonderful Time of Year pillow using a stencil from Dollar Tree. I've already washed and ironed this pillow cover, and now I'm placing my scrap piece of cardboard inside of my cover underneath where I'm going to be painting to prevent any bleed through on my fabric. Now I'm placing my stencil in the center of my cover, and for this I just eyeballed it. I didn't do exact measurements. Once I have my stencil all centered, I'm then taking some painter's tape and placing it around all four edges of my stencil to make sure it stays in place when I'm painting. Once again, I'm using my Dollar Tree stencil brush and my chalk paint in the color Ink, and I'm just painting over all of the words on the stencil. And like I said before, when I'm stenciling, I like to hold down around each letter so that I don't have any bleed through underneath my words. And here you can see my fingers are completely covered in paint, but I like to do it this way because I have a little bit more control, and the paint just washes off later, so it's no big deal. After the paint has completely dried, I'm then peeling off all of my tape and then removing my stencil. Here I've already flipped my pillow cover inside out, and now to heat set all of my paint, I'm going over all of the spots that I painted for about 20 to 30 seconds each on the hottest setting. After I have everything all heat set, I'm then flipping my pillow cover right side out and then placing my old throw pillow inside of my new finished cover. And these are my covers, both completely finished. I love how simple they were to make, and you can customize them to however you want them by using different stencils and different paint colors. For sign number 1, the materials I used were this sleigh-shaped hanging sign from Dollar Tree, an image printed on wax paper that I created on my computer, folk art chalk paint in the color Imperial and also in Java, Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, paintbrushes, burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, jute, bells from Dollar Tree that I've already spray painted, scissors, sandpaper, my hot glue gun, painter's tape, and an old gift card. To start out, I'm using my sandpaper to sand off all of the glitter that was on this sign and any of the lettering that was a little bit raised. And luckily there wasn't too much glitter, it was just on the snowflakes and the writing that was on here, so I didn't have to sand over the entire thing. Once I had all of the glitter sanded off, I'm then painting on my chalk paint in the color Plaster on the main parts of my sleigh, and I did have to do 3 coats of this paint. After all of my paint has dried, I'm then taking some painter's tape and creating what would be wood slats on the front of my sleigh. The first piece of tape I'm placing down on the very edge, which I wish I would have started in the middle so my lines would have been a little bit more even. So just keep that in mind if you're going to be doing this. And I'm placing some more tape all along the entire front of my sleigh, leaving a gap in between each piece of tape. In here I'm repositioning some of the tape that I'd already laid down to make my slats a little bit more even. Next, I'm painting on my chalk paint in the color Java in between all of the spaces between my painter's tape, and I did only have to do 1 coat of this paint. Once all of my paint has completely dried, I'm then just peeling off all of the tape. And then I'm taking my Java colored chalk paint once again, and I'm dry brushing that around all of the edges of the sleigh that I have painted in that plaster color. This is going to give my sleigh a little bit of an age distressed look, and then I'm also painting that around all of the flat edges of the sleigh as well. Next, I'm painting on my chalk paint in the color Imperial on my bottom sleigh rails, and I did have to do 3 to 4 coats just because I had painted on some of that plaster color and I had to cover that up. After all of my paint has dried, I'm then very carefully placing down the image that I printed on wax paper in the center of my sleigh. And I mean very carefully, because if I move the wax paper around at all, it will smudge the ink. And then I'm taking an old gift card and just pressing over all of the images that I have on the wax paper to transfer the ink onto my surface. I did create this image myself, and I'll have the printable image linked down below, and also if you're wanting to see a more in-depth tutorial on how I make my images to print onto my wax paper, I'll have that video linked down below as well. After I've gone over everything with a card, I do like to take the end of an old paintbrush and go over all of my lettering and my graphics. I think it helps press the ink into the surface a little bit better this way. You can always use like the end of a spoon, that works really great too. And also, if you are going to be doing the wax paper transfer method, just remember that any images that you use do need to be flipped when they're printed. Now that my image is all transferred, I'm peeling off the wax paper. Next, I'm creating my bow using this burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, and I'm using a large piece of ribbon, a medium piece, and a small piece to create my bow. The medium and small pieces I'm going to be forming into circles, so I'm placing some hot glue on the end of the ribbon and then placing the other end of the ribbon on the glue to make a complete circle, and I'm doing this for the medium and small piece. Then I'm stacking all of the pieces of a ribbon together and taking a piece of jute and tying it right around the middle. Next, I'm stringing 2 of these bells that I picked up from Dollar Tree onto a piece of jute. And the bells I did already have spray painted with the Rust-Oleum spray paint and oil rubbed bronze, and I had just already spray painted a bunch of them that I used in a previous video and had these ones left over. I'm taking those and tying them right on the very top part of my sleigh. Once I have those all attached, I'm then attaching my bow that I just made using some hot glue on the other side. And then cutting both ends of my ribbon on an angle. For the last step, I'm restringing my sign with some jute to create my hanger. And this is my sleigh sign all finished. I love the way that it turned out, and I can't believe how easy it was to create. And now moving on to sign number 2. For this project, I use this Joy tag-shaped sign from Dollar Tree, a flipped image printed onto wax paper that I created on my computer, Waverly chalk paint in the color ink and also in the color plaster, folk art chalk paint in Java, paintbrushes, jute, scissors, bells from Dollar Tree that I've already spray painted, and an old gift card. For this sign, I've just flipped it over since I'm going to be using the back side of this sign to make my new sign, and I'm just peeling off the tags that were attached onto the sign, and they were a little bit tricky to get off, so I had to take some of my sandpaper and sand off all of the sticky residue. Once that was off, I'm using my chalk paint in the color plaster, and I'm painting that all over my entire sign, and I did have to do 2 coats of this paint. Once all of my coats of paint have completely dried, I'm then taking this Java colored chalk paint and I'm dry brushing it around all of the edges to give it a distressed look. I'm also dry brushing that same color on the entire top surface of my sign, and I'm doing all of my brush strokes up and down, not side by side. And to give my sign a little bit more dimension, I'm using my chalk paint in the color ink, and I'm dry brushing that around all of the edges of my sign, and then also around all of the sides of the very front of my sign, kind of like I'm framing it with this black color. After I have everything all painted, I'm then placing my wax paper printout right in the center of my sign, and then using an old gift card to press all of my words and images right into the surface of my sign. This is going to transfer the ink onto my painted surface. I'm then using the end of an old paintbrush to go over all of my words and images, just like I did in the last transfer that I did earlier in the video. This helps press the ink in a little bit better, and you have more ink payoff this way, or at least I find that I have more ink payoff by doing it this way. And in case I forgot to mention, I did print my images on wax paper using an inkjet printer. Now that everything's all transferred, I'm peeling off my paper. Next, I'm stringing 2 of these bells that I picked up from Dollar Tree onto a piece of jute. These ones are also already spray painted in that Rust-Oleum spray paint and oil rubbed bronze. Then I'm just taking my piece of jute and restringing it through the pre-drilled hole, and then I'm taking the other end of the piece of jute and running it through that same hole. And to make it so that it doesn't come right out of the hole, I'm just tying 2 double knots to secure it. This jute is also going to be the hanger for my sign, so I'm just making another knot at the very top and then cutting off the long ends of the jute. And this is sign number 2 all finished, and this one's probably my favorite out of the 2. Both were really easy to create, and the wax paper transfer method has definitely been my go-to lately to create some really beautiful signs. And that wraps it up for all 30 of my favorite Christmas DIYs so far here on my channel. I hope that you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed, I hope that you will consider subscribing, and please be sure to hit the notification bell so that you don't miss out on any future videos. Thank you so much for watching.